Winter Melody, Chapter 1. The Song She Can't Finish. Grace Holloway had written 3 number-1 songs. Unfortunately, she couldn't finish the 4th. The unfinished lyrics sat on the passenger seat beside her as she drove through the falling snow. For 6 months, she'd been staring at the same half-written chorus. 6 months of crossed-out lines, 6 months of frustration, 6 months of pretending everything was fine. Her manager called it writer's block. Her record label called it a delay. Grace called it exhausting. The sign for Silver Pine Inn appeared through the snow. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Good. She was exhausted enough to drive into the mountains and hide for a while. That had to count for something. A few minutes later, she pulled into the parking lot. The inn looked like a Christmas card. Warm lights glowed through the windows. Snow covered the rooftops. A stone chimney sent smoke curling into the evening sky. For the first time all day, Grace felt herself relax. Just a little. Inside, the lobby smelled like cinnamon and pine. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace. The woman behind the front desk smiled immediately. "You must be Grace." Grace nodded. "That's me. I'm Claire Montgomery. Welcome to Silver Pine Inn." Something about Claire's voice made people feel comfortable. Grace wasn't sure how. It was probably a superpower. Claire handed her a brass key. "Cabin 9. Grace looked at the tag. "How far?" "5 minutes down the lantern path." "Good." Claire raised an eyebrow. That sounded suspiciously determined. Grace smiled. "I came here to avoid people." "Then you've chosen the correct end of the property." For the first time in weeks, Grace laughed. A real laugh. Not the one she used in interviews, not the one she used at award shows. A genuine one, Claire noticed. "See? You're already improving." Cabin 9 sat near the edge of the property. The nearest cabin was barely visible through the trees. Perfect. Grace carried her bags inside and immediately fell in love with the place. A stone fireplace, a small Christmas tree, a couch facing a wall of windows, and best of all, silence. No interviews, no producers, no executives asking when the album would be finished, just snow. Exactly what she needed. 3 hours later, Grace sat cross-legged on the couch with an acoustic guitar. The notebook rested open beside her. The unfinished song stared back. She played the verse again, then again, then again. The melody was there. The feeling was there. The ending refused to appear. Grace groaned. "Come on." The song ignored her. She tried another chord, then another. Nothing. The frustration built. So she played louder, then louder, then louder. A sudden thump echoed through the wall. Grace froze. A second thump followed. Then a voice. Deep, male, annoyed. "Some of us are trying to sleep." Grace stared at the wall. The wall stared back. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Grace set down her guitar. Slowly, carefully, and burst out laughing. Because apparently, even in the middle of nowhere, she had found someone who disliked her music. Outside, snow continued falling over Silver Pine Inn. Inside Cabin 9, Grace smiled for the first time in months. And somewhere beyond the wall, her very irritated neighbor had no idea he was about to become part of her story. Chapter 2. The World's Worst Neighbor. Grace spent the next morning convincing herself she was not curious about her neighbor. This lasted until breakfast. Silver Pine Inn's dining room buzzed with conversation and the smell of fresh coffee. Grace carried her plate toward an empty table. Then she saw him. The man from the wall. At least she assumed it was him. Tall, dark hair, broad shoulders, the expression of someone who had definitely complained about midnight guitar playing. He sat alone near the fireplace, drinking coffee. Grace immediately changed direction. Unfortunately, Claire saw this happen. "Good morning, Grace." Grace smiled. "Morning." Claire glanced toward the fireplace, then back at Grace, then toward the fireplace again. Grace narrowed her eyes. What? Claire looked innocent. It was entirely unconvincing. Nothing? You're matchmaking. I haven't said a word. You didn't have to. Claire smiled. Interesting theory. Grace sighed. Silver Pine Inn apparently came with opinions. A few minutes later, Grace sat at a table near the window. She had almost escaped unnoticed. Almost. You're the guitar player. Grace looked up. The neighbor stood beside her table holding a coffee mug. Oh, good, she said. The wall guy. He nodded. The wall guy. Grace pointed toward the empty chair. You here to complain? Thinking about it. He sat anyway. Grace studied him. He looked to be in his late 30s, confident, calm, annoyingly handsome, the worst kind. I'm Grace. I know. That surprised her. You do? Small inn, Fairpoint. He extended a hand. Jack Sullivan. Grace shook it. His grip was warm, steady, the sort of handshake that belonged to someone who worked outdoors. Let me guess, she said. You hate music? Jack looked offended. I love music. Grace blinked. Really? I just prefer it when I'm awake. She laughed despite herself. 1 point for the neighbor. For the next 10 minutes they exchanged the kind of conversation that wasn't quite friendly and wasn't quite an argument. Grace discovered Jack ran guided fishing trips and hiking tours in the area. Jack discovered Grace was avoiding questions about her job. Both noticed. Neither mentioned it. Eventually Jack nodded toward her notebook, the one she'd brought to breakfast. Writer. Grace looked down. The notebook lay open beside her plate. Lyrics covered the pages, crossed-out lines filled the margins. Something like that. Jack studied the notebook. You look frustrated. That's because I'm losing an argument. With who? Grace tapped the page. Myself. To her surprise, Jack nodded, like he understood exactly what she meant. Across the room, Emily appeared carrying a tray of cinnamon rolls. She immediately spotted them sitting together. Her eyes widened. Oh, Grace didn't like that sound. What? Emily set down the tray. Nothing. Claire walked past, took one look, and smiled. Grace pointed at both of them. See? That's the look. What look? Emily asked. The look where you've already decided something. Emily looked at Claire. Claire looked at Emily. Neither answered, which was answer enough. Jack seemed far too amused by this. Later that afternoon, Grace walked through town trying to clear her head. Unfortunately, the unfinished song came with her. Everywhere. The melody lingered. The missing chorus haunted her. Nothing worked. By the time she returned to the inn, she was even more frustrated than before. She stepped onto the porch of cabin 9, then stopped. A folded piece of paper sat beneath her door. Grace frowned. She picked it up. One sentence had been written across the page. Maybe stop trying to write the perfect song. Nothing else, no signature, no explanation. Grace stared at the note, then toward the neighboring cabin. A curtain moved. Barely. She smiled. For the first time in months, the unfinished song wasn't the most interesting thing in her life, and that was becoming a problem. Chapter 3. The lyrics between the lines. Grace spent most of the next day trying not to think about the note. Unfortunately, it was excellent advice, which made it even more annoying. Maybe stop trying to write the perfect song. Simple, reasonable, infuriating. Because deep down, she knew Jack was right. The problem was that she'd spent her entire career trying to write perfect songs. Now she wasn't sure how to write anything else. That afternoon, Grace carried her notebook to a bench overlooking the frozen pond. The mountains rose behind it, covered in fresh snow. It should have been peaceful. Instead, she stared at the same unfinished lyrics. Again. A shadow fell across the page. Grace looked up. Jack, you're frowning at paper. I'm winning. Doesn't look like it. He sat beside her. For a few moments neither spoke. Then Jack pointed at the notebook. "That's the song?" Grace hesitated. "Maybe." "That means yes." She sighed. "Yes." Jack nodded toward the pages. "What's wrong with it?" Grace laughed. "Where do I start?" "The beginning usually works." "Fair." She looked down at the lyrics. "I wrote the first verse 6 months ago." And then I got stuck." Jack waited. That was something she was beginning to notice about him. He didn't rush people. Eventually Grace continued. "It was supposed to be a breakup song." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Supposed to be?" She nodded. "The problem is it stopped being about the breakup." The words felt strange coming out loud because she'd never admitted them before. "Then what's it about?" Grace stared across the frozen pond, not knowing who I am without it. The confession hung in the cold air. Jack didn't laugh, didn't offer advice, didn't try to fix it. He simply nodded, like he understood. For a while they watched snow drift across the ice. Then Grace looked at him. "Your turn?" "My turn?" "You clearly know something about loss." Jack smiled faintly. "That obvious?" "A little." He leaned back against the bench. For a moment Grace thought he might change the subject. Instead, he surprised her. "My wife died 6 years ago." Grace froze. "Oh." The word felt painfully small. Jack looked toward the mountains. "Car accident." The simplicity of the sentence somehow made it sadder. Grace closed her notebook. "I'm sorry." Jack nodded. "So was I." For a moment neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just honest. The kind that existed when two people stopped pretending. Eventually Grace looked down at her notebook, then back at Jack. "You know what's weird?" "What?" "I've spent 6 months trying to write a song about moving on." Jack nodded. "And?" "I don't think it's about moving on." The realization arrived, suddenly, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Jack smiled. "What do you think it's about?" Grace looked at the unfinished chorus, then at the snow-covered trees surrounding Silver Pine Inn. Finally, she smiled. "Learning how to carry something without letting it carry you." Jack stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "That's a better song." The compliment caught her off guard, mostly because it wasn't really about the song. That evening Grace returned to Cabin 9. For the first time in months she didn't feel frustrated, nervous, excited, hopeful, but not frustrated. She sat on the couch with her guitar, opened the notebook, and began writing. One line, then another, then another. Outside, snow fell quietly over Silver Pine Inn. Inside Cabin 9, the missing chorus finally appeared. Not perfect, but real. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. Chapter 4. Snowfall and Silence. Grace woke before sunrise. For once, it wasn't because she was frustrated, it was because she was excited. The missing chorus sat in her notebook on the table beside the couch. She had written it, actually written it, not finished the entire song, but finished the part that had haunted her for months. The feeling was unfamiliar, like finally finding a road you'd been searching for in the dark. Later that morning she found Jack loading supplies into the back of a truck. Fishing gear, coolers, a thermos. Grace frowned. "You know it's winter, right?" Jack looked up. "Excellent observation. People fish in this weather? People do lots of strange things." Grace folded her arms. "Such as?" "Moving to Nashville," she pointed at him. "That was one time." Jack smiled. "Hop in." Grace blinked. "What?" "I'm checking one of the lake cabins. You just invite random people into your truck." "No." Jack closed the tailgate. "You're the first." Grace wasn't sure whether that was reassuring. An hour later, they stood beside a frozen mountain lake. The world was quiet, not city quiet, not studio quiet, real quiet, the kind that only existed in places where there were more trees than people. Grace pulled her coat tighter. "It's beautiful." Jack nodded. "Yeah." She looked at him. "Do you come out here often?" "Whenever I need to think." Grace laughed. "So you're avoiding people too?" Jack considered it. "Sometimes." "Fair enough." They walked along the shoreline for a while. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The mountains reflected across the frozen surface. Neither seemed in a hurry to fill the silence. Oddly, Grace liked that. Most people felt the need to constantly talk. Jack didn't. The silence never felt awkward, it felt peaceful. Eventually he stopped near a fallen log. "You know what's funny?" Grace sat beside him. "What?" "The first time I saw you, I thought you were going to be a nightmare." She laughed. "A nightmare? You were playing guitar at midnight." "That's fair." Jack smiled. "And now?" Grace asked. He looked out at the lake. "Now, I think you're just stubborn." Grace pointed at him. "That's barely an improvement." "It's an improvement." She couldn't argue with that. For a moment neither spoke. Then Grace surprised herself. "Can I ask you something?" Jack nodded. "Why didn't you ever leave?" He looked at her. "Leave Silver Pine?" She nodded. Jack thought for a moment, then smiled. "Because every time I considered it, something made me stay." Grace looked toward the mountains. The answer landed somewhere deep inside her. Because lately she'd been asking herself the opposite question. When would she leave? When would she go back to Nashville? Back to meetings, back to interviews, back to expectations. The thought no longer felt exciting, which was a problem. On the drive back to the inn, Grace's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Her manager. Jack noticed her expression immediately. "Bad news?" Grace sighed. "Not exactly." She answered the call. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When she hung up, she stared out the window. "What happened?" Jack asked. Grace looked down at the phone. "They want me back." Jack nodded slowly. The words hung between them, heavy, complicated. Because both of them knew what they really meant. Silver Pine wasn't going to last forever. Sooner or later, real life would be waiting. The question was whether Grace still wanted the life she'd left behind. As the truck rolled back toward the inn, she wasn't sure she knew the answer anymore, and that scared her. A lot. Chapter 5. The Last Verse. Grace spent the next 2 days avoiding her manager's phone calls. This strategy worked surprisingly well, mostly because she was at Silver Pine Inn. The outside world felt very far away here. Unfortunately, it wasn't actually far away, just quieter. Eventually her phone rang again, and again, and again. By the 4th call, even Emily noticed. "You know," Emily said while setting down a plate of cinnamon rolls, "most people answer those." Grace stared at the phone. "I was hoping it would give up." Emily nodded. "That's how bears work." "What? Phone calls don't." "Fair point." That afternoon, Grace finally answered. She stepped outside onto the porch of Cabin 9 and braced herself. "Hello?" "Grace." Her manager sounded relieved. "There you are." Grace sat in one of the rocking chairs. "Sorry." "No, you're not." "Fair." A long pause followed. Then came the real reason for the call. "We want you back in Nashville." Grace looked toward the mountains. "When?" "As soon as possible." Her stomach tightened. She'd known it was coming. That didn't make hearing it easier. "We've got producers waiting." Another pause. "The label wants to hear the new material." Grace glanced through the window at her notebook sitting on the table. The finished chorus, the completed song, the thing she'd been unable to write for 6 months. "It's done," she said quietly. "What?" "The song." Silence. Then a laugh, a happy one. "Grace, that's amazing." Maybe. It should have felt amazing. Instead, she felt sad. After the call ended, Grace found Jack sitting near the frozen pond. He looked up as she approached. "That bad?" She sat beside him. "Worse." Jack frowned. "Worse than bad?" "They're happy." That earned a laugh. "Okay, now you're definitely being a songwriter." Grace smiled. For a moment neither spoke. Then she handed him the notebook. Jack looked surprised. "What's this?" "The song." His eyebrows rose. "The actual song?" Grace nodded. "You wanted to hear it." Jack stared at the notebook, then at her. "You sure?" "No." "Good." That made her laugh. Jack opened the notebook. For several minutes he read in silence. Grace watched the frozen pond, the mountains, anything except his face. Finally he closed the notebook. "Well," Jack smiled. "It's good." She rolled her eyes. "That's not a real review." "Fine." He handed it back. "It's honest." The words hit harder than she expected, because honesty was what she'd been chasing all along. Not perfection, not radio hits, not awards, just honesty. Somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten that. That evening, Silver Pine Inn hosted a small Christmas gathering. Guests filled the lobby. Music played softly. The fireplace glowed. Lily raced through the room carrying Jasper the bear, while Daniel and Sarah attempted to keep up. Anna and Luke sat near the tree. Hank complained about Christmas music. Emily ignored him. Tradition, apparently. Grace stood near the back of the room, watching everything. The scene felt strangely familiar. Not because she'd lived it before, because it felt like something she'd written. A story about finding the right place at the right time. The kind of story she'd stopped believing in, until now. Her phone buzzed again, a text from her manager. "Flight leaves Monday, let me know." Grace stared at the message. Monday. 3 days. 3 days until she had to decide. Stay in Silver Pine a little longer, or return to the life she'd spent years building. Neither choice felt simple anymore. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. Across the room, Jack caught her eye. He smiled. A small smile, but enough. Grace smiled back, then looked toward the snow falling beyond the windows. 3 days. And suddenly she wasn't sure where home was anymore. Chapter 6. Winter Melody. The Christmas gathering continued long after sunset. The fireplace crackled. The lights on the tree glowed softly. Outside, snow drifted through the darkness. Inside, Grace couldn't stop thinking about Monday. 3 days. 3 days until Nashville. 3 days until meetings, interviews, deadlines, and expectations. 3 days until she left Silver Pine. The thought didn't feel right anymore, and that was the problem. The next morning, Grace found Claire arranging ornaments in the lobby. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said. Claire smiled. "Of course." "How do you know when you're supposed to leave somewhere?" Claire considered the question, then hung another ornament. "You don't," Grace sighed. "That's not helpful." "No," Claire agreed. "It's just true." Grace folded her arms. "So what do you do?" Claire smiled. "You figure out whether you're running towards something or away from something." The answer followed Grace for the rest of the day. That evening, Silver Pine Inn hosted its annual Christmas concert. The event wasn't fancy. A few guests sang, someone played piano. Lily performed a dramatic reading of a story involving a reindeer detective. Hank claimed it made no sense. Everyone ignored him. Tradition. Grace sat near the back of the room with her guitar resting beside her chair. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't planned to perform. But somehow, Claire, Emily, and half the inn had other ideas. Jack sat beside her. "You nervous?" "Terrified." "Good." Grace frowned. "Good. It means you care." Unfortunately, he had a point. An hour later, Emily stepped to the front of the room. "Last performer of the evening?" The room applauded. Grace immediately considered escaping through a window. Instead, she walked to the front of the room carrying her guitar. The crowd quieted. Daniel and Sarah smiled encouragingly. Anna squeezed Luke's hand. Claire looked proud. Hank looked skeptical. Also, tradition. Grace sat on the stool, adjusted the guitar, took a breath, then began to play. The room disappeared. The mountains, the snow, the inn, the people. Everything faded away except the song she'd spent 6 months trying to finish, the song she thought was about heartbreak, the song that had turned out to be about healing, about carrying the past without letting it define the future, about finding your way back to yourself. When she finished, the room remained silent, just for a moment. Then applause filled the lobby. Grace laughed in relief, the kind of laugh that came after holding your breath for too long. Later that night she found Jack standing outside beneath the stars. Snow covered the lantern path. The mountains stood silent around them. "You heard it first," she said. Jack smiled. "I know." Grace stepped beside him. For a moment neither spoke. Then she looked at him. "I figured something out." "What's that?" Grace smiled. "I don't hate Nashville." Jack nodded. "Good. I just don't want it to be the only thing in my life." The words felt right, completely right, for the first time in a long time. Jack looked at her. "What are you saying?" Grace laughed softly. "I'm saying I can leave." He nodded slowly. "And?" she smiled. "I'm also saying I'll come back." The smile that appeared on his face made her heart skip. Just once. But that was enough. Jack stepped closer. Not far, just enough. And this time, neither of them overthought it. The kiss was gentle, warm, unhurried, like the beginning of a song you'd been waiting to hear. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "That seemed worth staying up for," Jack said. Grace laughed. "Much better than listening through a wall." "Agreed." 2 days later, Grace loaded her bags into her car. The notebook sat safely in the passenger seat. The finished song rested inside. As she climbed behind the wheel, her phone buzzed. A text message. "Jack." "Drive safe, songwriter." Grace smiled, then replied, "See you soon, wall guy." She looked one last time at Silver Pine Inn, the glowing windows, the snowy pines, the place that had given her back something she thought she'd lost. Not her career, not her song, herself. With a smile, she started the engine and headed down the mountain, already looking forward to coming back. The end. Thank you for visiting Silver Pine Inn. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and join us for more heartwarming romances, second chances, and unforgettable guests at Silver Pine Inn. There are always new stories waiting just beyond the lantern path.